Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Parmenius podcast. Today we're excited to have another dialogue with a guest who I think has a shared interest in philosophy in the public sphere, so to speak, making philosophy publicly facing. And I'm delighted to be able to host this dialogue today. I'm Jordan Shepard, the host, and I'm here with Bernard Wills. How you doing today, Bernard?
Hi.
As usual, Professor Wills, Humanities Department up at Grenfell. And we're happy to have on our guest, Tali Folkins. How you doing, Tali?
Great. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Awesome. Yeah, we're really looking forward to asking a few questions about your channel. As I said, we have kind of a shared interest in public-facing philosophy, and Bernard turned us onto your channel by way of saying you had a particular interest in Plato. So your channel is called the Platonic Soul. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. It's I've always been sort of captivated by Plato since I first encountered Plato in my first year of university, and I toyed for a while with studying studying Plato in an academic way, but I ended up choosing a career in journalism. My encounter with Plato, Plato never really left me. I found myself thinking a lot about his writings over the years, and continuing to read them. And I found that I feel that my readings in Plato have made my life better in some way. And then I thought it would be sort of strange if I didn't share this with other people. So then I actually had the idea that I would write a book about this. But then, well, I have a family and a dog and a full-time job, and even with the help of a 2-month sabbatical from my workplace, I soon came to the realization that to finish this book project would take years. And I basically ran out of patience. And I decided I'm going to just cut to the chase here and start immediately ranting to people directly through YouTube, and basically do the whole book in installments and just see how it goes. So that's what I've been doing.
Well, I can see that, and the work is very, and your channel, it is very all-encompassing. I've seen that you touched on many subjects, from psychology, existentialism, the Platonic dialogues, and so for those of us not super initiated in the Platonic tradition, I know Bernard and you are both alums, master's degrees from King's. Is it where you guys really took a look at some of these texts? Like, I'm a humanities
Technically, the
student.
master's degrees are granted by Dalhousie.
Oh, my mistake.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but for those of us not super, I read some Plato. Those of us not super initiated into the Platonic tradition, can you guys tell us a bit more about what is this renewed interest in Plato?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, I think even to ask what Platonism is a good question, because don't you think, Bernie, it's the way it's been taught throughout history is not the way it's currently being taught, especially, I think, probably in the Anglo-American world.
The way I put it is there's a kind of textbook Plato out there. And so, in the first year of university or whatever, you get a simple potted version of, well, this is Plato's theories of forms and blah, 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 right? And then, of course, once you immerse yourself in the text, you realize this is such a more complicated world than that kind of cartoonish picture. That's I don't blame philosophy professors for this, because they have to simplify things and they have to flatten things out because they're communicating with 18-year-olds, right? But when that kind of kind of cliched, hackneyed textbook Plato enters scholarship, right, then I think it is quite deleterious. And I think, fortunately, I think Platonic scholarship has gotten much more sophisticated in the decades since you and I took it up, Tali. So I hope so, right?
Yeah. I think I know what you mean. I sort of have this sense too that there's sort of this first year Plato being taught where the emphasis is really on the forms, and there's sort of this whole other dimension that I guess you could sort of call quote unquote mystical, that we see partly in like the heirs to Plato in the sort of later Roman Empire, the Neoplatonists, but also we see a lot of hints of, I think, really in certain parts of like the Symposium or the Republic, where they talk about knowing the principle of reality and he avoids using, seems to prefer using verbs that suggest an immediacy, like with regard to how we get hold of the good, well, like getting hold of it, grasping it, seeing it, touching it, being with it. I think even using sort of sexual innuendo, I think. So I think, I don't know if that part of Plato ever really gets across to people who have only a sort of, whose professors don't have a lot of time
to do that.
And then also I think something that's important, a sort of tricky thing about our modern era that I mentioned in one of my videos is that or at least this is my take, because we live in the secular society and universities are expected to be these secular institutions, we can't really be teaching Plato as something that's true. That's how I understand it. You can't go to students and say, what was that Plotinus said at his deathbed? You can't go to your students and say, you must try to join the divine in you to the divine in the cosmos or something.
Yeah, and I think the best way to put our fingers on that, Tali, is to say that, we teach Plato as a philosophy, but of course, Platonism is a way of life. It's a path of personal progress. It's a matter of experience. And so, like, we don't teach Platonism and can't teach Platonism to students as a kind of praxis, right? As a kind of way, not only of perceiving the fundamental principles of reality, and, and I would go with Plotinus here, their fundamental non-duality, right? So, like, we're kind of purveyors of information, right? Where, like, scholars have, like Hadot, Hadot, right? The French the scholar. I mean, he's emphasized the way that, none of this makes sense unless you're taking it into the context of a personal quest and as a way of life. Right. And so we don't teach in a Platonic school in that sense, right? Where there's an assumed unity of the theory and the practice. Right. And that's, that's just a limitation we operate under, really. But you want to continue, Tali?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we may be saying the same thing because the reason maybe the reason you can't teach it as a praxis is because you can't. I mean, there are things that are practical sciences that are taught in the university, but you can't. Maybe you can't teach philosophy as a practice nowadays because you would only do that if everybody was convinced that it was true, maybe. And it's seen as the only thing that's really seen as objectively true nowadays is, I think, really is natural science. So you can't really prove quantifiably, that Plato is true. So it's there's no point, I guess, trying to establish whether it's true or not. My take is that the job of the professor is simply to try to, as best as they can, explain what Plato did actually say.
Okay. Well, yes. And so, like, for instance, say I'm not teaching Plato, say I'm teaching like Dionysus, the Divine Names or something, right?
Mm.
And the structure of that work involves like a purgation, an illumination, and a unification as an experience, right? So it's not a neutral, disengaged thinking. It's an
Mm.
invitation to participate in the experience
Mm.
of that kind of anagogic process whereby the soul is purged by practicing the ethical virtues, then it's illuminated by the intellectual virtues, and then by way of love it achieves henosis, or unification with its cause, right?
Mm.
But in a certain sense, Tali, maybe you're a little better positioned as a journalist than I am as a philosopher. Do you think so?
Well, the idea has occurred to me. I have disadvantages, of course, because I haven't had time to dig into these texts, especially I think the secondary literature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I know that has occurred to me that in a way, as somebody who's not attached to any institution, and as a journalist, as a journalist, my job is simply to just relay to people what they might find interesting.
Sure.
And so in a way, I kind of look at, I can kind of look at what I'm doing. I fancy myself something of an independent scholar, but I also see myself as sort of a journalist who is in a way traveling back in time and just trying to report back to people on what I'm seeing. Although in a way it's not really sort of straight news reporting, because there's a lot of editorializing
Well,
in it.
sure, yeah.
It's almost more like opinion pieces or something, because I'm also, but yeah, in the opinion piece in journalism, you're absolutely free to say this is right, this is wrong,
It's wrong. Yeah.
this is good, this is bad. And so yeah, it is in a way, it is in a way, I think I do sense a certain freedom. On my channel, I can just sort of rant in whatever way I want, or exhort people to do what I think, to try to get the benefit out of these writings that I think can be gotten out of them. So for people's own personal lives.
I had a question for you, Tali.
Mm.
Yeah. And maybe this comes back to journalism in a way, I don't know, because journalism is presumably something that roots you very directly in contemporary. But, for me and you, I would suspect, and tell me if I'm off base here, Tali, right? Plato stands forth in Western philosophy, and also Socrates before him, very much as the philosopher of reason, right? Philosopher of critical thinking. For me, and possibly for you, Plato is a philosopher of ecstasy. That's what. Yeah. But of course, ecstasy is a great problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've talked about the Bacchae on your channel.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what place do the Dionysian rites? What place does that establish? But then you spoke of immediacy, right? Before that, right? The immediacy in which one grasps the good, or like the way I put it, the immediacy in which one is grasped by it. But right?
I think in these ecstatic states, there's the distinction between grasping and being grasped.
Being grasped, yeah. But ecstasy is a problem, isn't it? Right? And I'm not, and one could refer that literally to things like the drug culture, or you could look at something like charismatic Pentecostalism, right? Where there is this kind of immediate ecstatic participation in song and dance and movement and ecstasy in the Spirit of God, right? But when that kind of emphasis on ecstatic experience, or what the thinkers of the Enlightenment used to call enthusiasm, when that enters the public sphere, it seems to bring with it all kinds of dangerous mythical thinking, and something that seems to escape any kind of rational or critical control altogether. And, suddenly Donald Trump is King Cyrus or he's King David, right?
Yeah.
And so so there's an immediate absorption in the symbols of the Bible, say, right?
Oh, yeah.
And an utterly uncritical application of those to the contemporary world, right? Yet
Yeah.
that seems to be the threat of ecstasy, and that's presumably for King Pentheus, that's the threat that Dionysus presents to the city. And in a certain sense, in the United States, that's the the threat that Tammy Faye Baker or whoever, right, presents to the order of the city, right? It brings enthusiasm, it brings ecstasy in a sense that swallows a culture of reason, and threatens to swallow our sense of solid reality, right? And like for me, Tali, like that's the oldest problem in the book, but it's also the most contemporary problem.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Because I mean, especially nightmarishly, I think in the 20th century with these Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism.
Yes.
Initially, it's like a party. Actually, my great grandmother was Latvian, but she was attending the University of St. Petersburg, and she was there during the Russian Revolution. And she said it was like a party.
It was like a party, of course.
Yeah.
1789.
Yeah. And so there's this loss of distinction between self and other. That's really exhilarating. It's Dionysian, but I think we're playing with fire because we all crave. I think we all crave to lose ourselves, and so we're all vulnerable to these appeals to the Dionysian, and we can get caught up in them, and and so I think. I may have I don't know if I actually may have interrupted you in your question, Bernie, but
no, I'm good.
But I think what the great thing of Plato, I think, really is when you mentioned earlier, people see Socrates and Plato rightly as philosophers of reason. Socrates with dialectic wanting to undermine people of their comfortable assumptions, and Plato positing these eternal forms, but whereas we see him as a philosopher of ecstasy. But I think I'm guessing I would complete your thought here by saying that we probably see him as both. And that the wonderful thing about him, I think, is that he does, and I think this has stumped people. I have this by.
It stumps me. It stumps me, Tali. So
well, yeah. It is. It actually, it does. But I remember reading this. Bertrand Russell was sort of stumped by these two things in Plato, and it is very difficult, and it may not even really be. I mean, yeah, it stumps me. But at least his aspiration, I think, is clearly to reconcile these two things, to guide people. I think to posit the highest reality, if I could put it this way, the highest truth is sort of involves a transcendence of subject and object, so that the quest for unity and the quest for truth, which seem to be in our everyday lives two opposed things, like they're sort of similar to the division between the battle of reason and passion. I think he's just revolutionary because he's saying there are both different aspects of the same thing, like this yearning for reality, to be joined immediately with truth. But yeah, the difficult thing is I'm thinking of that, I guess, particularly of that part in the Republic where he talks about he talks about the good as being the principle, but he doesn't. He tantalizingly doesn't really explain, doesn't he? He maybe he alludes, as he often teasingly does, to discussions they've had elsewhere or at some other time.
Yeah.
and so I think, yeah, I believe there's a lot of scholarly debate on how you get there from here. Like, how do you get to the good as being the principle of everything? So that's the real tricky part, I think, of Plato. But it doesn't mean that there's no point speculating or and I think it could be it's enjoyable to try to look at that from all these different angles to see, I mean, in a way it's even there, I think, in popular wisdom. I mean, we say every day that you're above ground is a good one. So in a way, there's a sense that goodness is like, is what life kind of comes from. I don't know. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, how about, Tali, we take it back to Euripides for a second? Because if there's one thing we know, is that in some deep sense, King Pentheus is wrong. Okay. I mean, he's not wrong in the sense that there is no danger to admitting the cult of Dionysus into the city. We can all see what the danger is, right? But at the same time, it becomes crystal clear that any city that excludes those, techniques and practices of ecstasy is an incomplete city, right?
Yeah.
It will always be fighting a losing battle against the destructive forms of those energies. So, like, war on drugs or something like this, right? Or prohibition, right? Like a city that tries to simply exclude those energies is going to find itself in a state of constant self-division, right? Like that city will have, in the Platonic sense, a divided will, right?
Yeah, and I think I might jump in sort of typically Platonic fashion. You know how in the Republic it's sort of a parallel discussion through it of individuals and states, and I think the same is true of what you're saying of individuals. I mean, to simply repress the sort of Dionysian seems to lay us on a path to a kind of self-destruction or something.
Yeah. And of course, the hard thing, or I mean, what I find, and I know you've got a video on the Bacchae. Yeah. What does Dionysus look like in his? Let me put it this way: what does he look like in his proper divine form, in his proper form that manifests the good of the principle that he embodies, right? Because of course we can see on one level that the violence of Dionysus in that play is elicited precisely by the attempt to repress him. Right? So so Dionysus becomes savage, right, or manifests this savage character precisely when Pentheus attempts to banish him from the city, right? Yet Pentheus cannot banish the Dionysian from himself. He's easily hypnotized, right? Like Dionysus has no trouble hypnotizing him and dressing him up in woman's clothes and things, right?
That's right.
Right. But Euripides only seems to offer us hints, Tali, about like what is a city in which the Dionysian rites are properly honored, right? He doesn't exactly say, does he?
I think I might do the opposite of what Plato does at the beginning of the Republic, where he goes from, he talks about we can see where justice is in the individual by seeing where it is in a city. And I might answer your question by looking at sort of the individual.
Sure.
Because I think what Plato is saying in the Symposium, and I don't know if this is kind of unorthodox or sort of radical, but I think what he's saying, I think what he's saying is that the problem is that Eros has to be completely unbridled. Like it's through trying to shape it in different ways that it ends up taking these objective forms, like a lust for money, or
Mhm.
a lust for another, to temporarily enjoy another person's body or something.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
but it has to be, it doesn't want to be restrained
Drained.
by this subject object relationship.
Yeah.
And so we want to open ourselves. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here.
Yeah.
I kind of think that when it comes right down to it, so what is the takeaway from Plato? What is he
Mhm.
asking us to do? And this is a big discussion because, like, there's a lot of talk about, like, we know Socrates was religiously controversial,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
say the
Yeah.
least. And I think Plato feared that too, because he talks about the person who frees himself from the cave, that his co-workers might want to try to even kill him or something like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, but actually, I can't figure out what the takeaway from, and in a way this is also a kind of maybe a more journalistic way of, because
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
is what we're always asked to do as in a way as journalists. Well, what difference does this make to person on the street? I don't know
Mhm.
what his takeaway is ultimately, other than that he is asking us to pray or something like it.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I don't know. One thing that I would like to talk about is, because we also have now this that is maybe partly displaced prayer, these similar
Yeah.
concepts of
Yeah.
mindfulness. And I
Yeah.
don't, prayer, mindfulness, I don't know. Um, there's different opinions about
Yeah.
how much they
Yeah.
overlap and how much
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
identical. But
Meditative technique is not alien to the Platonic tradition.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I don't, and certainly Plato is obviously pious. So he wrote lots of references to prayer. So
Mhm.
I think he is asking us that we somehow find a way to open ourselves up to
Mhm.
reality. But so how do you do that? I think it's kind of it's sort of easier said than done,
And
right?
done.
But like uh I think in a weird way it is opening oneself up to the body, which is
Mhm.
really heterodox. But I think so. Here's my opinion, because like Plato is, we think of Plato, especially in the Phaedo, but all over the place, being
Mhm.
hostile to the body, right?
Wrongly, I think.
I think so, because I
Yeah.
think what he's talking about body is, he means like that subject, objectification of the world.
Yeah.
Like, so
Yeah.
if he talks about body being prone to error, he means a body like making the mind drawing conclusions about sensual perceptions, like the stick
Yeah.
in the water. He's
Yeah.
not talking about what we would call mindfulness or prayer. When
Mhm.
what he, or this sort of immediate, you could say, intuitions of reality, when he wants to, even though we feel nowadays in 2024, we would talk about this is a body mind thing, like um it's mindfulness and there's no
Mhm.
objectification. But when he wants to talk about that, he talks about the divine, like the daimonic,
Mhm.
or the divine. Like, I'm thinking particularly like the Phaedrus,
Yeah.
where he talks about the divine madness as
Mhm.
inspiration. So yeah, I think basically the takeaway is we need to find some way. And also the other thing is, it's, you could say it's sort of a mystical knowledge, right? Obviously in some
Mhm.
sense we are talking about a mystical knowledge, but
Yeah.
there's also, because in the ladder of love, in the symposium, where he has that ecstatic vision and it's just
Mhm.
knowledge. But as you know, of course, there's this other, Diotima seems to talk in this other way about begetting in the beautiful
Yeah.
as the end of eros. And
Yeah.
I think that's also very puzzling. But the sense that I make of it is that he's trying to get away from the idea of knowledge as a kind of, as the same kind of way you would know about anything else, and that
Mhm.
it's a knowledge that defies. It's not a knowledge that involves abstraction, and it's not a knowledge that involves
Yeah.
sitting down and thinking about something. It's a kind of almost kinetic knowledge. That's
Yeah.
what I like to put it. Like begetting in the beautiful, it's a
Yeah.
knowledge that we might have in in motion, in doing, and
Yeah.
it's a kind of it's not really I guess it's not really a stateable thing, but we know it when it's
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
or we like to think we know it. Who
yeah.
knows?
Yeah. Okay, so let me try and push this a little further, Tali. Okay, so we have a problem. We're puzzled. We're baffled. We've read the Bacchae, right? We've read Plato, and we don't know where the proper boundary line between, rational contemplation and mystical ecstasy really is. Okay, but then we have Hegel to remind us that the real is the rational, right? And so, in a certain sense, the reconciliation of those things is already out there for us, right? And so, the most obvious example of that, I think, is of course music, right? A great musical performance is precisely what unites the brilliant technical control and the brilliant intellectuality of the musician with the ecstasy of the performance, right? So there's one thing we have to begin with right there. What is it that's going on in music, where music is this thing that's so bodily, yet it also has this intensely rational, even mathematical component. And in a great musical performance, there's no tension between those two things, right? In a not so great musical performance, maybe there is, but right. And furthermore, we have cultures, and like you in your video series, Tali, have talked about shamanism, right? Yeah. In cultures where shamanism is an institution, the shaman is an important person in the community, right? Like he's not a destructive, out of control mystic, right?
Right.
He practices techniques of ecstasy, yet he practices them for the healing of and the good of his neighbors and the healing and the good of the community, right? So his ecstasy is enfolded in a kind of justice already, right? So the reconciliations we seek and fail to find intellectually, I sometimes think, maybe are right out there in the world.
Yeah, I think so. And I think these things aren't. I've got a lot of things going on in my mind at the same time, because one of them is that art is just really, really interesting to talk about with, or Plato is really interesting to talk about with respect to art and music and stuff. And same with Augustine. This whole Platonic tradition has this fascinatingly ambivalent relation to them, right? Because Plato is just so, he can be so ruthless. But then there's so much artistry in his own writing. Like, I mean, especially the Phaedrus and the Symposium, they're so inspired. So, and same with Augustine. I mean, it's kind of like a poetic prose that he writes sometimes. But, and also I think, I don't know if I have got from these Platonists a good explanation of how art works on us. And it's possible that they didn't. Plato, for him, the important thing was that it does work. He talks about, and I think it works in this, almost has this sort of, you could say, angelic or daimonic influence on us. Even something in us is being rearranged and processed without our even consciously thinking about it. Because I remember in one of the early books of the Republic, he talks about youth being improved, like their souls being shaped for the better through good either poetry or music. And it's as though it's not as though it spurs them to it stimulates their thinking. It's more that it just works on them. And sometimes you feel sometimes when you actually, I think sometimes when you stand before a beautiful, it could be that the best art brings us to this almost prayerful state, where you could call it that you sense you're in the presence of something numinous. So you stand before an amazing painting and instead of like looking at the different parts of it, you can open yourself up to just the wonder of it and almost sense that you're being rearranged on the inside for the better. And the same with music, I think. I don't know if I've really answered your question.
Well, okay, we've gotten part of the way there, Tali, because of course we in the bourgeois West have a very easy time starting, to seeing the broader question in relation to the individual. So on the individual level, we can, the harmonization of the synthesis of reason and ecstasy can be attained in things like the arts, or in appropriating the meditative practices of various kinds of contemplative traditions. So, right, so I'll give you an example, like on Mount Athos there, right? The monks are taught not only to pray with their mind and pray with their soul, but to pray with their breath and to pray with their body, right? And in the Hindu tradition, you can find all comparable conditions, accounts of contemplation there. That's the same, right? That prayer is not only a movement of the soul; it's a movement of the breath. Right? And indeed, it becomes a movement of the soul through a certain disciplining of the breath and a certain focusing on the body, and so on and so forth. All right. So that's what they're like up there doing on Athos or whatever. Right. Right. So in the bourgeois West, we can work out these individual compromises. Right. But what is it for a city, or what is it for a community to be open in the way that you speak of?
Oh yeah, I mean,
and by the way, I'm asking you that, Tali, because I want to know.
Yeah, I to be honest, I think this might be like the great problem of our time, because I think I've thought about that. I think I might not have framed it in exactly the same way, but I think I think this is really difficult, because how do you, like, everybody wants a secular society, so how do we communally open ourselves to like absolute reality, or how do we communally attain a kind of oneness with truth, in a way that respects everybody's desire to just go their own way.
Everybody's desires, and like legitimately the vast array of individual places that different individuals are starting from, right? I mean, because it's a basic principle of rhetoric that you address your speech to the situation of the person you're attempting to communicate with, right? So I mean, for myself, this involves, like, if I were to stumble out an answer, right? I mean, the music of a society, or the ecstasy of a society, is its justice in a certain sense. If that's not too mystical sounding, right?
I'm curious what you mean. It's the way it conceives justice, or the way it lives out justice in its social arrangement.
Well, yes, because let's just take the example of peace, right? Peace, or the desire to make peace, or to bring about peace with the other, is the most radical risk you can take. Right? There's nothing riskier than making a peace offer, right? Because of course, the assumption that you're working from is that, well, the other will take advantage, right? Like the other will play you for a sucker, right? So there's an ecstasy, or kind of, transcending of the ego in things like peace, in things like reconciliation, in things like forgiveness, right? In things like, say, opening oneself to a whole new problem of justice, right? So, in the 21st century, right? What is justice to the refugee, right? Like we live in this global society in which people not only want to move about, but are frequently forced to move about, right? And it's
Mhm.
challenging our sense of the traditional markers we have of national identity or social unity and so on and so forth, right?
Mm.
And there, and as you can see from the reactions, there's a terrible risk to letting the other into your country, right? Well, oh my God, maybe they're bringing diseases, maybe they're bringing bombs, right? Like there's a rational fear, right? And that kind of clinging to the particularity of an identity that's invoked when one encounters the other as making a new and unfamiliar kind of demand of justice. Right? And of course, people are fearful of that, right? But a city that is open to justice in the way one might be open to a painting or open to a work of art, right? Faces the newness of these situations with a kind and I can't help myself here. I don't want to Christianize this discussion, Tali, but this is where the question of agape or caritas comes in. Right, because I think I mean the ecstasy of a society, right, is its charity, the radicalness of its charity. What risk will it take to be open to the other, to be open to the needs and the humanities of the other, right? And as we can see, like this is the most difficult challenge an individual or a human can face, right? So like the challenge of forgiveness. Right? If I forgive this person, they're going to take me for a sucker, right? If I let these people from Venezuela or Haiti into the country, they're just gonna get welfare, right? They're gonna play us for suckers, right? So always that fear, right? And that's kind of and that's kind of like that's kind of like the position of King Pentheus, right? I mean, I mean, you could do a whole thing, I think, on Dionysus as a refugee, because in a certain sense, right, he does not belong to Thebes, but he comes to Thebes. And the question is, do we welcome this otherness into Thebes, or do we just shut the doors? Like, no, take your Dionysus elsewhere, right? I don't know. What do you think, Tali?
Yeah, this is a new idea to me, and I think it's something I'm gonna want to sort of ruminate over. I think it's quite interesting. I do think, what was I going to say? That I think, yeah, in some ways, maybe how we incorporate this. There's another way that comes to me that may not be irreconcilable with what you just said, which is that how we incorporate the ecstatic to the city or communally is to letting go of dogma, because then we are that, which is also frightening. I think that's also we're left without any handrails. And then I think how do we I'm not sure where I was going to go with that, but it is it's a sort of temporary suspension of a habitual subject-object way of looking at the world.
Exactly. And a society can be open to justice by stretching itself beyond. I mean, it comes down to subject-object, doesn't it? Right? It comes down to preserving a certain dogmatized form of my own subjectivity or personal identity and so on in the face of an object that questions or threatens it, right? So if I were to go out on a limb, you've gone out on a limb, right? An ecstatic society is a radically open society.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, open-minded, for example.
Yeah, open-minded, but even more importantly, open-hearted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I'm wondering. Yeah, that's right. Because I think because I was thinking about this. So I was thinking, what's the key to this ladder of love? Like, how do you ascend, right, up the diotima's ladder of love? Is it through being open-minded that you're able to get to these higher levels? But isn't open-mindedness actually isn't it just a refusal to take anything as true? Like, isn't open-mindedness, doesn't it just come down to like skepticism, actually, like a refusal to believe anything?
Okay. And by the way, skepticism does emerge later as a moment in the Platonic Academy. So there is absolutely a skeptical moment there, right? And then you get academic skepticism and suspense of judgment and all of this kind of stuff, right? But I think there's a skepticism that is an openness to being transformed by something above the fixed categories of discursive understanding, and a skepticism that just rests in a contradiction and gives up, right? Socrates is skeptical about the virtues, right? Laches tells him what courage is, and he says, no, Laches, that's not what courage is, right? And one attitude you can take to that is, well, I'll suspend the question of courage. But that's not what Socrates is doing, right? Like every skeptical turn that he takes is an attempt to open himself more and more to the character of what the true virtue is, right? And in that dialectical sense is that the virtue is waiting to manifest itself, right? If you just clear away these finite idols of the understanding. And perhaps that is something we could agree on.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that is something like what you meant when you said open-hearted a little earlier. Although I would probably need to think that through a little bit more.
Sure. What is the heart as opposed to, right?
Yeah. Really, what do we mean by that? Yeah.
If the mind is participatory in its world in a way.
We've discussed hearts before in this.
Absolutely. It has to involve the element of feeling in our worlds, the reintegration of that, right? So
no, we earlier in the podcast, Tali, we had an indigenous Mi'kmaq person who was talking about cardiac health. Right. And the interesting thing about that is that the heart is so much more than an organ that pumps, right? And we know this very directly from the way that all kinds of things that have nothing directly to do with physiology impact cardiac health, right? So rootedness in a community, rootedness in a language, and like a heart never exists anywhere. A human heart never exists anywhere but in a community, right? And that, and so, she was just, bringing this up by way of pointing out all kinds of differential statistics concerning cardiac health, right? Between indigenous populations and other populations, right? And that's just not pumping what she's talking about there, right? I mean, she's talking about a kind of body-world relation or embeddedness of body, right? In the world, right? Like, dare I say, I don't want to go all Heideggerian here, but the heart's kind of a mode of Dasein, right?
Absolutely.
But at any rate, how are we for time there, Jordan?
I suppose there's so many more questions, but in proper Heideggerian fashion, we're our radical finitude.
Oh, radical finitude. Let's give Tali a chance to sum up Platonic Soul and sum up what he thinks of the discussion.
Yeah, we're super happy to talk more about Platonic Soul. And Tali, thank you for being with us. If you can tell us, what is the future direction of the channel, and yeah.
Oh yeah. Sure. Basically, I want to, and I don't know how many episodes this will take because I always find I start planning an episode and then I'm like, oh no, that's too much to talk about in one episode. So the whole thing has ended up taking me more episodes than I thought it would. But I would like to basically, in some sense, the whole channel so far has been kind of still sort of introducing the problem, but we are finally about to dig sort of deeply into the symposium and then get to this extremely crucial, very difficult thing, sort of what we just talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast about how about the good as the aspiration, as the ultimate aspiration of people. So I would like to basically talk about how I believe Plato solves this problem, which was both particular to his time and it's universal, and I think it's particularly relevant to our time. And then I think that will take a while because there are a lot of passageways that I would like to go down in solving and trying to explain that. But then eventually I will reach a point, I guess, where I will have committed my whole book or the planned book to these episodes. And then when I've got the whole thing down, I would like to just, my thought is that I would like to just, it would be a show where I sort of take, in a way, quote unquote, Platonic takes on things, or that I just use to just basically vent about whatever I want to, but coming out of this position that I've sort of outlined in the book. And I'd like to talk about what we just talked about earlier about what I see as the ultimate sort of takeaway of Plato, not just sort of solving Plato's solution, sort of theoretical problem solution of this problem, but what kind of takeaway do we take away from this?
Yeah, and thank you both for getting us out of the textbook Plato. It's very invitational for me as a kind of really a fellow reader.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah. We'll probably be in touch at some point.
We'd love the dialogue again.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd love to.
All right.
Good. Signing off. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
And good luck to the family.
Thanks very much.
What's your son's name? Ulysses?
Yeah, Eli Ulysses.
Eli Ulysses. What a fantastic name.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Yes. Okay. Bye.
All right.